and welcome back to the IEA channel. My name's Emily Carver. I'm the media manager at the IEA. In today's video, I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Davies, the IEA's head of education. We're going to be discussing his new paper out this week, To a Radical Degree, Reshaping the UK's Higher Education for the Post-Pandemic World. In this paper, Steve argues that the current system of higher education has reached a dead end. The virus has only made a bad situation worse, and that the sector is in need of reform. If you enjoy this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, and why not leave a comment letting us know what you think. Hi Steve, thanks for joining me.
Hi there. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So in your paper, you refer to the fundamentally unsound nature of the policy of successive governments, and that universities have been heading in the wrong direction since the mid-80s. Could you elaborate on what's gone wrong over recent decades that's led us to this point and what COVID-19 has exposed?
Well, two things really. Since the mid-1980s, and the Jarrett report, British universities have been explicitly modelled and thought of, both by themselves and by governments, as businesses competing in a market. Now, you might think, oh, this would be a good idea, but in fact, it's not, because they're not actually like businesses, and they're not competing in a proper market. That's the big problem. This is actually a classic example of the extension of the business model into an area where it's not appropriate. But the big problem is the second one, which is that governments have been expanding, looking to expand the number of people going into higher education. This was begun under the Major government, which had a target for increasing the number of students, and also at a stroke by rebadging polytechnics as universities, doubled the number of people in getting a university degree. But it really took off after 1997, when Tony Blair made a target of 50% of all 18-year-olds going to university being the main goal. Now, the problem with that is this. The thinking behind this was that more graduates meant a more productive and skilled workforce, which would mean higher GDP, it would mean rising productivity and therefore higher incomes for the graduates. And also it was thought it would lead to greater social mobility, because you'd have more people from a wider range of social backgrounds going into higher education, getting high paid jobs. Seems to make perfect sense. The problem is none of this has worked. If you look at the actual pattern, our productivity performance has been diabolical, quite frankly, since 2008. And I think it was artificially inflated before then because of the way we counted supposed increases in productivity in the financial services sector. Social mobility has actually declined by most metrics. The universities are more than ever the preserve of the middle classes, pretty much. And it is not the case that people are actually more productive. Employers are constantly complaining that they cannot get skilled staff. And there's an acute shortage of skilled tradesmen in particular across a whole range of trades and occupations in the UK. Meanwhile, however, the number of jobs that requires a degree has kept pace with the increase in graduates. So we've gone from a situation where about 1 in 5 jobs required a degree, to a situation now where at the latest count 35% of jobs require a degree. Jobs that you could have got simply with an A-level, or even just after leaving school before then, in an earlier age. And so the point is, these jobs have not become more skilled, they've not become more demanding, it's simply that the bar to get into them has become higher. And that reflects the reason why that business model doesn't work, which is that most university degrees do not make you more productive. The idea that a university course enhances what we call human capital, your skills and the things that make you productive, that is true for a certain number of degrees. It's true for engineering, it's true for medicine, it's true for music, but it's not true for something like 90% plus of all degrees. What those degrees do instead is provide a signal to employers. It's a low-cost way for employers to find out what kind of person you are. And what having a degree does is tell the employer that you are reasonably hardworking, reasonably bright, you are rule compliant and obedient, you're not a complete wild man or woman, you can work to deadlines, and you've got reasonable social skills. And it saves them the trouble of finding this out about you by, say, employing you for a short time or making you do an aptitude test. For the people who want to get the job, what they do is they pay to get a degree, and what they're actually buying is a signal. Now, that's the root cause of the problem, because what it means is that if you're the university, you cannot, for example, offer a cut price degree. You cannot reduce the fees and compete with other universities on fees, because if you do that, you are sending out a message that the quality of the degree as a signal is lower than it is for somewhere where you paid more, and that's disastrous. Nobody will want to come to you. You also can't compete in terms of things like modes of attendance, mode of study, things of that sort, offer different variety, because if you do that, you'll confuse the employer. They won't be sure what the signal is telling them anymore. And so what this means is you do not have a proper competitive market. You've got no price differentiation, no price competition, no product variation, none of the things you get in a normal competitive market. Instead, you get a very bad kind of competition.
We often hear from employers, from businesses in different sectors and industries, that the graduates that they're taking on just aren't up to scratch. They don't have the basic skills. Is that a symptom of, or caused by the fact that the university sector has just exploded and the quality of the education and of the certificates has dropped?
It is, because if my argument is correct, and the main value of a degree is a signal it gives the employer about what kind of person you are, then when that signal is only acquired by, say, 10% of the population, the signal, if you like, is stronger. The larger the number of people who get it, the more noise, as they call it technically, there is. In other words, the less likely it is that the signal will give you an accurate position. And so employers increasingly find that, sure, maybe the person they got is quite reliable, hardworking, and rule compliant, but they lack all kinds of other skills that really they would like to assume you have. In addition, there's the problem that the assumption behind the original expansion was that, well, when we had 10% of people going to university, 10% of the population got high-paid, high-status jobs. So if we have 50% of the population going to university, 50% are going to get high-paid, high-status jobs. It doesn't work that way. The problem is that, in fact, there's only a certain number of high-paid, high-status jobs at any given time. And so what's happening now is that 1/3 of all graduates are doing jobs that do not require a degree. So they spent 3 years of their life out of the workforce and foregone all the income they would have had. They've laid out a large amount of money on student fees, and at the end of it, they're no better off than they would have been if they hadn't gone to university in the first place. So that's a really bad position to be in. So as far as both the employers and the graduates are concerned, it's an increasingly bad deal.
Yeah, I think there's a large moral question there, particularly for students who have invested money, time into a degree course thinking that that will better them in the future and lead to better jobs prospects, and they're just being let down entirely by the system. How do you think that the system could be, could better serve the interests of students themselves? I know you make a number of recommendations in your paper, including major areas where there needs to be a philosophical reset, you say.
Yes, precisely. I think that we need to move away from the idea of certification, in other words. The problem is that I think university education, since actually even before the mid-1980s, has been moving away from the idea that really a university degree is for most people a consumption good. In other words, it used to be the case that you went to university as an end in itself. It was a pure consumption good, unless you were trained to become a doctor or a lawyer. You simply went to enjoy learning about things that you were interested in, and maybe becoming a more rounded person in some ways in the process. We've moved away from that to the idea that it's all about trying to get a high-paid, high-status job, and I think that's the big philosophical reset that we need to have. In addition to that, though, what we need to do, I think, is think much more about the institutional modes of supply, if you want to be pompous about it, the kinds of institutions that we have, the kind of products in terms of courses that they offer and provide. Because one of the things that's striking is how back in the 80s or 70s, there was actually much more variety in higher education in terms of kinds of institutions there were, the kinds of degrees on offer, and the kind of courses and teaching modes there were, than there is now. They're now very, very similar. Basically, everyone is trying to be Oxford or Cambridge, but on a tenth of the budget, basically. And that's just not the way to go down. What we need, as they have to some degree in the United States, although they have the same kind of problems that we do in some ways, is a much wider variety of institutions. You need things like liberal arts colleges which specialize in teaching, research institutions, institutions that focus only on certain subject areas, a lot more vocational and trade-based university education of the kind that the Germans do extremely well, for example. That is the big lack in our higher education system, and has been for, rather depressingly, for over 140 years. People were moaning about this in the 1880s, for heaven's sake. So that's not a new problem, but that's the kind of variety we need. We also need much more variety in modes of attendance, ways of funding university than we do at the moment. The current system we have is a disaster for everybody. It's a disaster for the students who end up with debt. Most of them, however, almost half of them, will never repay that student loan because they won't ever earn enough to trigger the repayments, which means that it's going to be picked up by the taxpayer. So although it doesn't count against the government's debt liability, it should actually. So we actually have the worst of both worlds. We have students with lots of debt, many of them finding it quite traumatic or problematic, but at the same time, half of them are never going to repay it. So there's a huge amount of public outlay. So the whole system we fund university students at the moment is I think, just not working, and we should move away from it to something much more varied, much more pluralistic.
So what has the impact been of COVID-19? You talk about university finances, that they've been impacted immeasurably, many universities running large deficits, a fall in demand from international students. Is it essentially a necessity, a financial necessity for universities to change?
Yes, it is. The thing is this, COVID has had an immediate short-term impact this year. It's created a hole in universities' finances on the order of £6 billion plus because of students not coming, students not paying hall fees because they're not attending in person, not being able to make money over the vacations from renting out accommodation. So they're facing a short-term, really acute cash flow problem. This is going to continue into next year because almost certainly a lot of students who've been accepted for places this coming year are going to defer because they're going to have to do half their course virtually, and they may wonder why they're paying the full cost for what is actually only half of the experience they would be getting. So there's going to be significant disruption going forward. In addition, I think the hits to overseas student income, which is a very large part of the income of many of the top 20 or 30 research universities, is going to be permanent or very long lasting. In particular, we're going to see almost certainly far fewer East Asian and probably South Asian students in UK higher education. Now, this would not matter so much if it was not for the fact that a lot of universities were already in a very perilous financial situation before COVID came. There's a number of institutions, including some not that far away from where you are, not naming any names, that were already on their financial uppers before the pandemic struck. Now, what that tells you is that they had an unsustainable business model. And it's just like any other sector. What the virus has done is to reveal which people, in the famous expression, have been swimming with no clothes on. Which people were already financially exposed, vulnerable, had a faulty business model. And a lot of universities did, because what they were doing was competing to attract students on the basis of things like lavish facilities. So they borrowed large amounts to build fancy halls of residence or new buildings. They were also competing in terms of trying to attract staff in that way more than they could actually afford or sustain. And so the result is they've been found out. Now, the really bad response to this would be for the government to bail out the university sector so that it could go back to the way it was doing before. Because I think that we've now reached that 50% target. And it's pretty clear that there isn't going to be any expansion of student numbers in the future in the way that we've gotten used to over the last 20, 30 years. And so that model had already, I think, reached the end of its particular road. As it is, it's going to, I think, overseas students and other intake of that is never going to recover. So we would be a really big error to bail out the existing system under the expectation that things are going to go back to the way they were before. Fortunately, I think both the government and the opposition seem to be moving to the position that they want to have a big rethink or reset about this. No doubt there'll be lots of arguments about what to do exactly. But I think that there is going to be a reset. And the thing to do is to be brave and be quite radical about this and really start thinking fundamentally about what kind of university system we want to have, what role we want to play in society, and above all, as I keep on saying, to try and arrive at something that is much more varied, much more flexible, much more pluralistic than the kind of monoculture that we have at the moment. I'd add, by the way, that I have no problems with 50% of the population going to university. I think that's in many ways an admirable ideal. What I do not agree with is that 50% of 18-year-olds should go to university. One of the things we really should be thinking about is whether or not university isn't something that is best for many people later on in life, in their 30s, for example, when they've acquired a lot of experience, been out in the world of work, become simply more mature.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting idea. Just finally, before we finish, I wanted to ask you about private universities. We've got 5 now in the UK. What do you think we can learn from that approach? Do you think that that's the future?
I think that is part of the way forward. One of the things we need to do, I think, again, in terms of the pluralism, is to have lots of different models of ownership. And different models of internal governance. So I think quite a lot of universities should go back to the old medieval model, which in a way we had before the Jarrett report, albeit in watered down form, where the university belongs to its fellows. It's a kind of community, or almost like a monastery of scholars, if you will. That's a model I think should be revived. We should also look at things which are profit-making institutions, particularly perhaps institutions that are offering what are definitely human capital enhancing courses like engineering or various kind of trade qualifications of one kind or another. That's a highly appropriate area for a more commercial-minded thing to do. Now, in the United States, you have a large for-profit sector in higher education. I have to say, a large part of that is actually a scam, because what it's all about basically is getting your sticky fingers onto government grants. But part of it is not like that. Part of it is just straightforwardly offering a product which is valuable, which is useful skills, training in a whole range of useful occupations, for example. And that's that part of the US profit sector is something that we could learn from, I think, if we ignore the ones that, as I say, are basically there trying to take people's federal government student grants off them and not give them much back in return.
And am I right in thinking that some specialist schools in the US educate students for free, and then later on the students are required to pay back
that's one of the funding models
of their income?
Yeah, exactly. That is one of the funding models we should explore. If you are doing a course that is going to significantly enhance your earning prospects later on, because it has made you more productive or open doors that otherwise would not be open to you, then one of the ways of doing it is to have something like the current student loan system, but done purely privately. The institution itself could then reclaim some of your income. It could have essentially like a lien or a bond on some of your future income, which it would take back from you, so that you would retrospectively repay the service they'd provided you by educating you in certain skills and up to a certain level. On the other hand, you might have this funding from an outside source. You might well get people who invest in you as a young prospect on the expectation that at some point in the future you will repay them with a certain amount of interest, obviously, but not too much, I would imagine. And also, it could well be the case that companies might well be prepared to pay for their staff to go to universities to either maybe just become a well-rounded person if they're senior management, or acquire useful skills, and that this again could be funded or repaid for out of some kind of charge on earnings in the future, which you could always buy out, of course. So you have a lien of this kind. There's always the option, if you come into money or no longer want to continue paying it on a continuous basis, to just buy it out. The way contracts work in professional sports, for example, where, if you're a footballer and you want to move your team, you can always just buy out your contract, and many of them quite often do this. So there are all kinds of ways in which we could fund higher education. We've got an extremely stunted kind of view about what options there are at the moment.
Well, thank you, Steve, for joining me. If you would like to read Steve's paper, the link will be in the description box below. And if you enjoy this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.